Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. First of all, I want to thank Representative Bonnie Coleman for putting together this important conversation and allowing us to discuss the future of work, the future of wealth, and the future of housing. All of the critical work that she has been able to do in regards to economic security and economic justice really has shaped the conversation here in Congress and around the nation. Before the COVID-19 pandemic began, we were already facing a shortage of affordable housing and lack of access to the resources for our housed and unhoused communities. This pandemic has only heightened these issues and has made it clear that housing is a fundamental human right that should be afforded to all people. Right now, staying inside and socially distancing can save a person's life, but not everyone has the ability to do so, and many are on the verge of losing that ability. I firmly believe that housing is a right and not a privilege. And due to COVID, we are uniquely positioned to create real change that would positively impact our communities. Housing impacts more than we think. It intersects with our access to healthcare and our interactions with the carceral state. The looming eviction crisis is expected to endanger up to 40 million Americans, overwhelmingly who are low income, Black and brown people in our communities. These are people who are already grappling with police violence, systematic racism, and housing discrimination. Adding to that troubling situation, evictions are often carried out by local sheriff's office and other local law enforcement agencies. At the same time, billionaires and millionaires are making more money than ever, while literally millions can't afford food, healthcare, and housing. So this is why we are gathering for these important conversations, because we know this has to change. And now I am delighted to welcome our convener, our champion, and the person who has been able to really generate this conversation around economic security and social justice, Representative Bonnie Watson-Coleman.
Thank you, Ilhan. I know my name is a mouthful. I tell people I was born with that Watson name that I love and respect, and I worked hard for the Coleman part. So I just want to acknowledge the journey. I can't think of anybody I'd rather have this conversation with than you, because of the work that you've done before you even came to Congress and the concern that you have for those who are least among us. You're right. This has been a 3-day conference, economically based conference, looking at jobs and the importance of our well-being and our access to the American dream for working families, and the issue of the discussion we had with the great Deb Haaland yesterday on access to wealth and what does that mean. And now we're going to deal with housing, a fundamental right. You're absolutely right. It impacts our ability to have a good education, ability to be close to jobs, ability to be close to transportation systems, and the ability to live in decent, safe, and affordable housing. All of these things together, I think, represent a formula for looking at, getting at, and hopefully eliminating poverty. No family should be expected to live under the yoke of poverty. And if we can address these issues that we've been addressing over the last 3 days, then I think that we can establish a floor beneath which no family will fall and which each family can live and survive and thrive. I want to thank your amazing moderator, who is going to lead this discussion. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedule. And thank you to the panelists who are going to share their expertise and their passion. These have been an important discussion, so I do hope that those people who are catching this one, who didn't catch the second one or the first one, will look for those, because it is a continuum of conversation. Thank you, and God bless.
Thank you, Representative Watson Coleman. You're right. Today we are going to have a discussion not just on the issues that are pertaining to housing, but also offering a solution. And we have a great set of panelists. But first, I want to introduce our moderator, Tara Raghuveer of the People Action Institute, who will lead this discussion and who will allow for us not only to revisit the issues as it pertains to housing and the crisis that's upon us, but also the solutions that we have in addressing it, because we have lots of solutions. Tara, take it away.
Thank you so much. And I need to start by thanking Representative Omar for her bold leadership on this issue. She is a true visionary, and along with her colleagues, Representative Watson Coleman and Representative Holland, she's been a champion for the people. I just want to start by saying that time and time again, when poor and working class tenants come to Representative Omar with an idea, she not only takes it on, but also includes those same tenants in the process along the way. And we are so appreciative of her for that. And I'm thrilled to be here today. As Representative Omar said, my name is Tara Raghuveer, and I'm the Homes Guarantee Campaign Director at People's Action Institute. We're a network of grassroots organizations across the country. And before we begin with this panel, I want to introduce the two other panelists really briefly, and you'll get to know them more as we move on with the conversation. The first is Nelima Sitati Munene, who is a community development professional. She's a current executive director of the African Career Education and Resources Incorporated, an issue-based organization working in the Twin Cities to advance equity, and especially within the African immigrant community. And my friend, Thomas Silverstein, is counsel at the Fair Housing and Community Development Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And his work focuses on impact litigation under the Fair Housing Act and efforts to increase compliance with the duty to affirmatively further fair housing through policy advocacy, administrative enforcement, and technical assistance. And these are some of the boldest visionaries that I know working on housing across the country. So we're going to have a great conversation today. And I want to thank you all for your tremendous work. So let's get to business. We'll begin by talking about a homes guarantee. For us at People's Action, the idea of a homes guarantee was launched publicly around this time last year. And it was an idea that was really informed by the leadership of grassroots tenants and organizers across the country. And they came to us and they said they wanted to establish a new flank for what progressive housing policy could look like in America. And we wanted to kind of reimagine a federal role for housing policy. So for us, a homes guarantee is simple. We live in the richest country in the history of the world. We can and we must guarantee that everyone has a safe, accessible, sustainable, truly and permanently affordable home, period. But this simple premise, of course, is one that's complicated by what I would like to call a conspiracy of the profiteers that has stifled our imagination. And it's led us to believe that housing is a commodity and that it can't be a human right and that it must be delivered by the private market. So the Homes Guarantee for us is a campaign that aims to transform housing from commodity to public good and ultimately to guarantee that housing is delivered to every American as a human right once and for all. So I want to start with Nelima, who's coming to this conversation from the Twin Cities. Nelima, what do you think about when you hear Homes Guarantee, and what is your vision for what this could mean for your community?
Sure. Thank you so much, Tara. I appreciate the conversation. I think for starters, at no time in history has this become a more important conversation, especially in the midst of a current pandemic that we are facing. And I think, like I like to say a lot, is I think what the COVID-19 pandemic has done is really exposed what we as housing organizers, housing advocates have known for a very long time, and have been saying for a very long time, and receiving, a lot of pushback about the precarious condition of housing, or lack of thereof of housing in the United States. And so, for example, when the COVID pandemic broke out and we started getting these stay-home orders, which were very appropriate in order for us to begin even to grapple with the pandemic and try to contain it, it became abundantly clear that what happens to folks who do not have access to housing. And so for a long time, we've been saying that housing is a basic and fundamental human right. And for us and my organization and the folks that we work with here in Minnesota, that is our premise of the housing guarantee, that housing is a basic and fundamental human right. It is a necessity. People need shelter. And so when we were being asked to shelter in place, it became abundantly clear that because we don't have a guarantee to housing for everybody, then there were people who are not going to be able to shelter in place. And going beyond that, we believe that a housing guarantee is going to be guaranteed that everybody has access to safe housing. The housing has to be safe, it has to be accessible, it has to be sustainable housing, and it has to be permanently affordable. And so what does that mean? I think a lot of times we talk about affordable housing, but then the question behind that is that who is it affordable to? Because even the way affordable housing is determined, or is explained maybe even from a federal level or from HUD, it is usually not affordable to everybody. If you look at the housing market right now, most of the affordable housing that is being developed is at around 80% area median incomes, 60% area median incomes, which, for example, here in the Twin Cities, the average, median income quickly rises, because if we include, the wealthier areas of the Twin Cities, it quickly goes up to about an average of about $90,000, which does not reflect what the people who are really struggling, with housing are facing, and that is not their income. And so a housing guarantee would say that everybody, it doesn't matter what your income is, it doesn't matter where you live, it doesn't matter where you come from, that everybody will have access to housing, and that housing will be safe and accessible. In the United States currently, we have over 12 million people who are spending a lot more of their income on housing. And so these are people who are housing insecure. And so what that means that even though we have a certain number of people who are out on the streets and unsheltered or homeless, couch hopping and homeless, we've not even counted the people who we term as housing insecure, who are many of us, frankly. For most Americans, we're only one emergency away from being homeless. That means that you cannot have a medical crisis, your car cannot break down. I mean, like, nothing can happen because people are overstretched. Even people who are living in so-called affordable housing, or what is sometimes termed as natural occurring affordable housing, they are spending most of their income on housing, and especially the lower income they are, the more the percentage they are spending on housing. And so for most people who are renting, low income tenants, they're spending upwards of 50% or more on their rent. And when we have talked to our constituency base and said, what does this mean for you? It impacts other areas of their life, because people are going to struggle to put food on the table first. With the COVID pandemic, when people started losing income and etc., people were being kept in a situation where they're having to make a decision between, do I feed my children? Do I put food on the table? Or do I pay my rent first so that I do not get evicted before all this eviction moratorium started rolling out, and which are not really in every state? And the other thing, we talk to people even before the COVID-19, when we ask them, what does it mean that you're paying 50% or more on your rent? And this is what they say. That means that even though I have access to go to the medical clinic, if the doctor gives me my prescription, I don't get to fill my whole prescription. I am going to fill either half of my prescription, or on a bad month, I'm just not going to fill my prescription at all. And so we know that they're not addressing their health issues, and so we continue to have this disparate outcomes in terms in health, that continues to be perpetrated among folks who are at risk of losing housing. And so housing guarantee means that we make a firm commitment to reinvest in public and deeply affordable housing. So the biggest need right now in housing is 30% area median income level. And as I mentioned before, even when it comes to affordable housing, no one is really building at 30% AMI. Most of the affordable housing that is currently being built is at 60% AMI or 80% AMI. And so there's a huge deficit. And that is the irony about it all, that that we have this housing market and the demand is not, we don't have enough supply to meet the real demand, because the real demand is really at 30% area median income, and that demand is not being met. A housing guarantee also means that we are centering people, that we're not just thinking of housing as brick and mortar or as infrastructure, that we are thinking about who is this housing for and what is the purpose it is serving. And so once we begin to center people, then we're saying that along with this housing, we have to protect tenants' rights. There's a lot of unscrupulous landlords out there, as well as good landlords, but that means that in order for people not to become homeless or not to have be at risk of being homeless, we have to make sure that we're protecting tenants' rights so that they're not being targeted when they're demanding for their rights. And also, the housing crisis didn't just happen. This is not just happenstance. There's historical context. There are historical policies, both public and policies, and also public and private practices that have led us to where we are. And that is why there's a great disproportionality on who is being most impacted by these issues and who is most at risk. And so in order for us to have a sustainable housing guarantee, we have to address the historical injustices and oppression that have led us to this point, and we have to start correcting them so that we can move forward. We can't keep on just putting a band-aid over a long-term problem. And so that means that we're moving forward with a racial justice lens, that we are saying that everybody is valuable, that providing access to housing to everybody benefits all of us, that this is a people issue. And so we're going to center people in the solutions that we're coming up with, but most important of all, that we are centering the folks who are most impacted, the people who have the lived experience of what is going on, so that they can lead the conversation about what are the true sustainable solutions to get us to where we need to be. And so part of those things include making a firm commitment to invest in public housing, which right now has a deficit of about $70 billion, and also investing in an increased supply, of affordable housing to the tune of, over $45 billion. And we know that there's a value in doing this. For example, our learnings and our data tell us that when we invest, that when we have a shortage of affordable housing, it is costing our economy about $2 trillion a year, because people cannot be able to access higher wage jobs in communities where they cannot afford the housing. So a housing guarantee not only takes care of a basic and fundamental human right of our communities, but it also offers a huge return on our investment. We need to start investing in people. Thank you.
Ooh, Nelima, I'm so glad we're in conversation, because I feel like we already share a brain. Thank you so much. And you just dropped some amazing statistics. I want to call one thing out that you said, right? I want to make sure that everyone here heard Nelima when she said 12 million households pay over 50% of their income to rent.
Right.
And that was before the pandemic, right? Now we're living in the middle of an unemployment crisis unlike anything we've ever seen. And so many more people are even more cost burdened when it comes to their housing than they were before. So I want to turn it over to Representative Omar, because that 12 million number is something that's very significant based on the leadership that you've taken on this issue. Representative Omar, tell us about the Homes for All Act of 2019, and how will that piece of legislation take us towards the homes guarantee that Nelima just beautifully envisioned for us?
Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Nelima, for that, because what you underscored is that the housing crisis didn't begin with the coronavirus crisis, right? American families have long struggled with homelessness and housing insecurity. The pandemic presents us with an opportunity to reassess the system that is failing so many people and to fundamentally transform our approach to housing. As a nation, it's going to be really important for us to understand housing not as a commodity, but as a human right. And it's important for us to continue to underscore that 50% or more, to 12 million Americans and more are paying 50% and more for housing, and I'm included in that, which is why these policies have been very personal to me, and that's why I've been very passionate about them. And it is important for us to say that we now can have an opportunity to invest in housing on a scale that's not seen since the New Deal, which is why, with the help of so many grassroots organizations and organizers, we were able to introduce the very transformative and visionary policy Homes for All, which does really address what it means for us to really guarantee homes for people. This legislation will authorize a construction of 12 million public housing and affordable housing, private affordable housing units. It protects families from gentrification. It prevents displacement. It helps stabilize neighborhoods by creating a separate fund for neighborhood restabilization. It also makes public housing a mandatory part of the federal budget, just like we do with Medicaid and Social Security, because we recognize investing in public housing will help expand the available affordable housing stock, which will drive down costs throughout the market. With so many urgent crises unfolding before us right now, it is easy to neglect the looming threat of climate change. But the climate crisis is already devastating so many communities across the globe, disproportionately impacting Indigenous communities and people of color. And our Homes for All also addresses that. As we've seen so many people being displaced by the climate crisis, it's important for us to think about constructing housing units that adhere to the highest available environmental standards. And under the Homes for All, public housing will be designed, built, and operated in accord with those highest standards to ensure safety for all of the tenants. Decarbonized housing which is also a really core part of the Green New Deal, will allow for people, regardless of what zip code they might be in, to have the opportunity to thrive. I think oftentimes we think about housing in silo, and we forget how that's connected, as the representative said earlier, to our education, to our health, to the environment, to the basic sustainability of our communities. And if we don't really holistically address the housing shortage, the housing crisis, the insecurity in housing that people are facing, the homelessness that currently exists in our communities, we will continue to backfill, and that actually costs us more money than it will if we decided to fully invest in a policy like Homes for All.
Thank you so much, Representative Omar, and thanks again for your vision on this. I love that both you and Nelima have been so clear on the intersections between this issue and so many other issues. And I'm glad you both mentioned education, because we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. But before we move on from the Homes Guarantee, Thomas, you've been one of the leading experts who has kind of made this grassroots vision into the legislation that Representative Omar is talking about. And considering the moment that we're in right now, and everything that's going on that Representative Omar described, what would it mean for working people, for us to win a homes guarantee in America? And how would it have potentially changed the situation that we now find ourselves in if we had a guarantee before COVID even occurred?
Thanks, Tara. So again, my name is Thomas Silverstein. I'm counsel in the Fair Housing and Community Development Project of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. We're a national civil rights legal nonprofit that has the mission of combating racial discrimination through the leveraging of the leadership and resources of the private bar, particularly emphasizing on working to counteract and eradicate discrimination against Black communities. When Tara first approached me about working on the Homes Guarantee campaign, I immediately thought that it was incredibly compelling and recognized the deep organizing with directly impacted residents that led to this vision. And, there are many sort of discrete, very concrete examples of what a Homes Guarantee would mean for working people. But I want to start at a somewhat higher level, which is that I think that at a really, really, really important way, a Homes Guarantee would provide a platform for recognizing basic human dignity and the potential for human flourishing in ways that simply aren't possible in our commodity-based housing market as it exists today in the United States of America. When people are worried about how to make rent, saying that the rent eats first, they're not able to make bets on themselves, to take chances, to leave jobs that are demoralizing and unsatisfying, to pursue their dreams and passions. So, if we want to have a society, working people can, build happy, fulfilling, self-actualized lives for themselves, they need to have the peace of mind that their basic human right to housing is respected, is honored, and that if they leave their job to go back to school, if they leave their job to pursue a passion, to make art, to start a small business, that they can do so without having to worry about whether there's going to be a roof over their head. And that's, it may sound very philosophical and sort of high-minded, but I think that it's really important not to lose sight of in this conversation. But beyond that, there are, and Representative Omar alluded to many of these different areas, but there are very concrete, specific material ways in the here and now that a Homes Guarantee would improve conditions for working people. With respect to employment, when people are housing insecure, when they are homeless, it is much more difficult in practical ways on a day-to-day basis to maintain employment. You're more likely to miss work because of health conditions that are exacerbated by homelessness or adverse housing conditions. You have less of a platform from which to do a job search for a better paying job or a job that's a better fit for your skills and interests. And if you have the stability of home and a guaranteed right to a home, you do not have to, worry about whether lacking a place to sleep that night is going to cause you to miss work the next day. With respect to education, I think many people know that where people attend school and what schools they attend, is intimately related to patterns of racial residential segregation that have deep historical roots in private industry and government policies going back to the New Deal and redlining, but also, pervading up to the present day, and to really attack disparities in school finance and school equity, which we're going to talk about in more detail. You have to really address issues with respect to housing. But even leaving aside issues of the schools that folks are attending, when you don't have a quiet place to do homework, when you're exposed to lead paint, when you're sleeping in a car, and when you're switching schools possibly multiple times each year, you're not placed in a position to succeed. So having that stability of a home where you have space, you have peace and quiet to study on a day-to-day, week-in, week-out basis, obviously provides children with a much greater ability to learn and grow than in the absence of a Homes Guarantee. With respect to health, the COVID pandemic has put in stark relief the simple fact that you can't socially distance in overcrowded housing, in housing that is unhealthy and deteriorated, or in a state of homelessness. But the COVID pandemic is only casting into stark relief what we already knew, which is that there are significant health intersections with housing, both related to the quality of housing. So if we are able to retrofit housing, to remediate lead paint, to build housing that's safer and healthier, then we have the ability to materially improve the health conditions of working class people and people of color in particular. And if we are able to build housing that really hasn't been built before in communities that have healthier environmental conditions, but that have historically resisted subsidized housing, public housing, and affordable housing, then families of color that have been excluded from those neighborhoods historically can access the recreational amenities and the clean air and water that may exist in those places, but not in the historically redlined communities, which they have had few choices outside of in the past. A homes guarantee is both important for working people in the immediate short term in these concrete, specific ways. And it's also, I think, a deep philosophical principle that is something that can really help people transcend the sort of malaise that many people find themselves in today. And the scale of the solution, I think, is the final thing that I'll highlight that's very, very important. We have been stuck for years in a pattern of tinkering with a sort of set of legacy housing policies, some of which have various good points to commend them, some of which are more problematic, none of which operate at the scale of the need. And through transformative policy proposals like Representative Omar's legislation, recognizing that 12 million unit goal, we have the ability to really change things and change things rapidly. This is a proposal that can be part of a just transition as part of a Green New Deal. When we talk about building 12 million units, we are also talking about creating many, many good, well-paying, dignified jobs. And I think that's also worth highlighting as part of the broader impact and positive impact of a homes guarantee in practical terms for working class folks. Thanks, Tara.
Thank you so much, Thomas. And I love that you declared an end to the era of tinkering. We're done with tinkering. Ain't nobody got time for tinkering or incrementalism anymore. I mean, the scale of the problems that we're talking about is so immense, to your point, that we have to take much broader action. And another thing that I love that you said, Thomas, was I love that you start by talking about how we need to actually transition to a world in which working people are not only surviving, but they're thriving, right? I'm thinking about that a lot right now. Yesterday, I had a phone call with one of the leaders of the grassroots organization that I run in Kansas City called KC Tenants. And this leader called me and said, I don't know if I'm having a heart attack or a panic attack right now, because she's in the middle of an eviction process, right? And she's probably the fourth leader in a week who's called me expressing this kind of mental health impact that housing insecurity is having on them. And, when I talked to Ashley about how she wanted to spend her day off, she didn't even conceive of the notion that she could do something like read a book or take care of herself. And that's the limitation of poverty, right? That's what happens to people when they're ground down by a system that just never lets them get a breath or get ahead. So I love that you started there. And I want to thank you both for your wisdom and your perspective on a homes guarantee. And let's transition to the next topic, which is, I think, not really a different topic at all. I think too often people separate homelessness and housing, and we all work in this space. So we know that that's actually a false separation. So I want to start with you, Nelima. Can you give us your perspective? How does homelessness affect your community, and what are the realities of homelessness in America in 2020?
Sure, thank you. Yes, I think there's also there's this anomaly about, talking about homelessness differently, from housing, when we know, of course, people are homeless because they're either housing insecure or don't have, access to housing. And so currently in our community, of course, we are seeing, an increase in homelessness. And I think that is just, all across the country, with with the housing crisis that is on our hand. We know we have insufficient housing. We have a lot of people who are very housing insecure, and that is posing, a big problem. What In terms of how homelessness is manifesting itself, especially I'm going to start, with what it looks like right now. So currently, we're defining homelessness as folks who, of course, are currently without housing, or officially, homelessness is also defined as if you're at risk of being without shelter, in the next 14 days, which more and more, of course, with the COVID pandemic has also become, like almost every month. It's become like almost every month right now in the midst of the COVID pandemic. And even though we have an eviction moratorium here in Minnesota, it is it's being extended on a month-to-month basis. So at any given time, if we don't know that whether the eviction moratorium is going to be extended, we have a lot of people who could be at risk of, of being evicted within 14 days, and so would be in that category. And also people who are at risk of losing their housing every given day, whether it's through a personal life situation, if they're in a life-threatening situation, or as I mentioned before, because of being overextended in terms of, the rent requirement. So if you're spending 50% of your income and above on rent, you're at risk of being homeless anytime, because you cannot afford to have an emergency. And we do know that life happens. So it's a really unrealistic situation to be in. And so what homelessness currently looks like in America, I think we're living at a time where we have this, an unprecedented time where we have this huge number of people who are at risk of being homeless. And what is different currently about that is that we have a lot of folks, a lot of the working poor, who are also fit in this category. And so what is so hard for us, for me especially, to fathom in this day and era, as you mentioned before, Tara, that we're living in the wealthiest nation in the world. And yet, we have people who are working. In my community, we have people who are working 2 jobs. So this idea that people who are homeless are people who are not working, who don't have a job, and etc. We're in a housing crisis because we have some people who are working 2 jobs and still are at risk of being homeless. And also, some people are actually, we have some people who are working and are actually homeless because they do not have their own housing. They are couch hopping, they're sleeping on somebody's couch and actually don't have a place to call home. And so this is a new this is a new phenomenon, that a homeless person is not just the person who is sheltering, sleeping outside under under the bridge, or sleeping under a tent. And there's some causes to to this. I mean, for example, as the cost of housing has increased continually, wages have just not matched. Wages have not matched the cost of living, and that is something that needs to be talked about. As a housing advocate, I always say that, we cannot have a conversation about housing without talking about a livable wage. So the conversation about housing has to go hand in hand, with the conversation about people being paid a livable wage. So the irony about it, what the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed, is that we have people who are very low, who are earning very low wages, who are most at risk of being homeless or are homeless. But when the pandemic broke out, lo and behold, we found out that their services are very essential for us, right? They were among the first people who were named as essential workers and actually had to go out there and put themselves at risk in order to work. And so this conversation about, and we're talking about housing today, but the conversation about a livable wage has to go hand in hand with the conversation about homelessness. And so the high price of housing is a big factor. And like I said before, the supply has not met the demand. So the biggest demand for housing right now is at the 30% area median income. And also the two other categories of folks that I want to talk about when it comes to homelessness. One is our elderly population. So we have the senior population. So we know that people are living longer now, thanks to medical interventions, which is great. But we have a lot of seniors in my community who are living on a fixed income, but yet and still we see the prices of housing continue to rise. So for example, I know in the Midwest we've been having this phenomenon of apartments being flipped over, being turned around into investors swooping in and buying all this national carrying affordable housing and flipping them over and turning them into luxury apartments, and with rents that are way out of reach for regular people. And even there's some senior housing that have been sold during this apartment flipping, and we have seniors who are on fixed income who cannot afford to have their rent increase because their income is not going to increase. And so that's a critical part of our population that we need to think about when we're thinking about homelessness, because they're really at risk. The other category of folks I want to talk about is about the youth. I mean, right now in the communities, especially youth who are transitioning, they've completed high school and they're going to college, and so they're not completely independent, but they're in the adults, young adult category. So youth who are 18 to 24 in my community are also very much at risk, and especially when they have to go away to college, whether it's within their state or etc. Student housing is so expensive. Student housing has become so expensive, and especially we have a lot of investors who are building around these college campuses, and we're not really asking where are college students living when they're going off to college, and they don't have a lot of income to pay for housing. So that is an important category of folks. And then on top of that, how do we expect them to be successful in completing their college when they're at such a risk of being homeless? And then we want to talk about the unsheltered population, people who are sleeping under the bridges, etc., because they don't have any shelter, because they just don't have any shelter over them, and who are experiencing chronic homelessness. And that number has continued to increase. We're seeing encampments pop up all over the place, as especially the COVID-19 continues to exacerbate, the housing crisis that we have already been in. And so some of the solutions that we think about is, we need, once again, a commitment to providing housing, especially where it is needed. And this can be in the form of federal housing assistance programs, which have been reduced over time. We want to make sure that we have permanent supportive housing. And so what does this mean? This means that when we're talking about increasing the supply of affordable housing, that we're providing housing that is affordable, but that also goes hand in hand with the wraparound supportive services that people need so that they can be successful. So that once we house people, we want to make sure that they're going to be successful in being able to live in their housing. And the third thing that we talk about in my community is about housing fast. So for a long time, programs that were serving people who are homeless and trying to get housing for them, there was this demand that you clean up your act fast, whatever that means, before you get into housing. But what we're working towards is saying we want to house people first, we want to shelter people first, and then work with them to connect them to the services that they need, and so that they can be successful. But overall, we need to make a commitment to funding public housing at the level that it is required, so that people can be able to have a guarantee that they're going to have shelter tomorrow. Because as was mentioned before, people cannot make long-term decisions in a crisis. If I do not have a guarantee that that I'm going to have housing for the next 2 or 3 years, I cannot even begin to make a decision about whether I want to go back to school, whether I am going to stay at this job, or whether I'm going to make a commitment to this other job with a 45-minute commute. So we want to make sure that we're making a long-term investment and commitment to addressing the homelessness issue, so that we can begin even to make a dent in this problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nelima. And as with the first answer, you kind of blew me away with the breadth, but also the depth of your vision about how we actually solve homelessness. Thomas, I want to turn it over to you and ask you, can you share a little bit more about how homelessness actually contributes to a cycle of poverty and actually contributes to reproducing poverty among poor and working class, and as Nelima said, working poor households?
Absolutely. Thanks, Tara. So in my prior remarks, I already mentioned the connection between homelessness and job instability, and homelessness and struggles with school achievement, both in terms of school performance and also remaining in school and graduating. And those are, I think, very important points. But there are three points I want to specifically address here in a little bit more depth. So one relates to health. And I think that a past act of Congress is actually illustrative here. For a couple decades now, we have had a program called the Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS, or HOPWA program. This is a block grant program that Congress created that's administered by HUD through local entities that receive money through this program to specifically do what the program suggests: help provide affordable housing for people who have HIV or AIDS. Part of the logic behind this program is that when people are on an intensive medication regimen, that if you don't have stable housing or if you are homeless, it is materially harder to stick to that medication regimen. And that is a logic that's absolutely true with respect to HIV and AIDS, but it's true with many medical conditions. And this gets back to the question of the scale of the problem. We should not have a society that's as wealthy as ours, that has the resources that our society has, that allows anyone to get sick or get more sick or even die of a chronic illness because they can't effectively manage their medication because they don't have a safe place to store it. It's simply absurd in the society in which we live. So that's one point I would want to raise. And the sort of connection back to poverty there, I think it can be quite clear. If you're unable to manage the symptoms of your chronic illness, then how are you supposed to consistently get to show up to work and make income through employment that will help you get back into housing and be able to afford the rent, right? There's, I think, a pretty logical connection there to that cycle of poverty. The second point I want to raise is that we have an epidemic across this country of criminalization of homelessness schemes perpetrated by local governments. And these can show up in a lot of different ways in terms of sweeps of homeless encampments, ordinances that ban camping within city limits or prohibit people from sleeping in their cars. And those are sort of some of the more formalized ways in which the criminalization of homelessness appears. There's also the more sort of mundane day-to-day drag of police harassment and sort of petty picking on homeless folks, and in particular unsheltered homeless folks, but not exclusively unsheltered homeless folks. And when you have this chronic high level of criminalization of homelessness, that means that people who are homeless often end up having extensive criminal records. It's very hard to exist outside as an unsheltered homeless person and not end up with some kind of a criminal record. And that in turn limits access to housing because so many housing providers restrict people who have certain types of criminal records, and sometimes all people with criminal records, from living in their properties. And I'll take a step back to point out briefly that I think it's really important that Representative Omar's Homes for All Act would prohibit banning people with criminal records from the housing units developed under the program. I think that's really, really important. And it's a pretty stark departure from nearly a quarter century of federal housing policy, which has taken a more or less the opposite approach. So when you have, again, this criminalization of homelessness and folks who are unhoused ending up with criminal records, that impedes their access to housing, which can be a platform for getting out of poverty. It also impedes their access to employment, since many employers won't hire someone who has a criminal record or an extensive criminal record. So when we're talking about homelessness and housing, we also have to talk about criminal justice, because the issues are very, very much intertwined. The last thing I'll say is that, and I think people have seen this, particularly in the context of this year and the COVID pandemic, is that a housing crisis, an eviction crisis, and a homelessness crisis are recipes for voter suppression. That when people are unhoused, how are they supposed to vote by mail if they can't receive mail? Will their voter, are they going to be in a position where they're able to effectively re-register after having moved out of a district because they're experiencing this instability? And the connection between voter suppression and poverty may not be as immediately intuitive or obvious for some. I think we see the need for progressive, transformative public policy interventions around poverty, whether it's the question of housing, whether it's the question of wealth, whether it's the question of work. And if working class people, and working class people of color in particular, are not able to vote or face extreme barriers to voting, then the chances of having elected officials who are responsive to their demands, grounded in deep organizing and lived experience, goes down. So how are we supposed to attack poverty if the people who have that lived experience and have articulated those demands don't have the ability to assert their voice through our democratic processes? And that is directly linked to homelessness. I think, there is a question of whether some cynical political officials may not be taking this crisis right now in the context of COVID as seriously as they ought to, and as they have a moral obligation to, because they would prefer to see people not participate. So, this is really cyclical. It's deeply cyclical, and these factors are intertwined. I think that particularly as we, sort of approach election season, and as we've gone through months of amazing and inspiring protests and uprisings against police violence, it's far past time to recognize the connection between housing, homelessness, and policing. Thanks, Tara.
Thanks so much, Thomas. I really appreciate all of that nuance. And, I think something that's been driving me a little bit bonkers the last couple of months is this reality that I know, and that the two of you know. We could have solved homelessness, right? We could solve homelessness today. We just printed $2 trillion from the Fed, and we gave it mostly to corporations and to institutions that really don't need a bailout right now. And meanwhile, we all know that the cost of actually just solving this problem once and for all through the solutions that Nelima discussed and Thomas discussed, the cost is not that large. And actually, to Nalima's point from earlier, it costs us more as a society, 3 times more, to treat homelessness than to prevent it, right? And that shouldn't be our motivation for doing it, because it's not about the cost. It's about guaranteeing that everyone has a home. But that's been kind of driving me bonkers during this period of time when we're actually just printing money, and we're realizing, at long last, that the government can actually just do some of these things. And so I think the question it raises for me is, like, who benefits from homelessness perpetuating? Because clearly the status quo, as it continues to be upheld, is benefiting someone. And we have to continue interrogating that reality as we continue with our work. So I want to move on to another issue that came up earlier in our conversation, and that's about the connections between housing and other issue areas. And this is actually one of the things that moves me the most about doing housing work and tenant organizing, is that there are so many connections with issues all over the place, as Thomas was saying, with voter rights, with criminal justice issues. So one of the deepest intersections, I think, is between housing and education, right? Evictions impact kids every day, their ability to stay in their seat at school and thrive. And on a more systemic level, the way we fund schools has everything to do with a history of bad housing policy and racist segregation, right? So I want to ask you both, and whichever one of you wants to can start, how does the model of school funding through property taxes perpetuate a cycle of poor housing and underfunded schools. I want to add something to this question. What are the racial justice implications, right? Because we have to be very real in summer 2020, talking about the ways in which how we've designed these funding streams and policies is completely and totally racist. And what are the other models that we should pursue, right? What are the other ways that we could be doing this that are anti-racist and also promote better education and better housing? Who wants to start?
I can go ahead. Thanks, Tara. So I think there are a few sort of layers and wrinkles to this question. So fundamentally, if we are committed as a society to treating housing as a human right and not as a commodity, then we are also committed to a model that is not premised on sort of an endless upward curve of property value increase and therefore increased property tax base, regardless of what community we're working in. So if we really want to decommodify housing, then we have to take seriously the challenge of not just thinking about how to make a system of school finance based on property taxes fairer, but whether property taxes are actually a just or equitable or logical tool for school finance. And I'll take a step back to say that I'm very much not speaking on behalf of the Lawyers Committee, and I'm speaking in my own capacity on this question, as we have an education team, and I'm sure they have their own thoughts on these questions. But I think that when we take a step back from property taxes as the vehicle for school funding, a few issues come into relief. One is that it makes sense for school funding to be to a much greater extent than it is now, driven at the state, some combination of the state and federal levels rather than the local level, because the tax vehicles that would make sense for raising the level of money necessary for good schools, would primarily be through things like an income tax, which is obviously a tried and true method of raising revenue and one that can be deeply progressive, but also newer and more innovative ideas for progressive taxation, like a wealth tax. Those are tools that are probably more operational at the state or federal level, frankly, than they are at the local level, which is not to discourage anyone from considering those policies at the local level, but they are easier to implement and would result in less risk of sort of capital flight or wealthy people moving one town over to avoid taxes. It's harder to move one state over, and it's further than that, harder to move out of the country to avoid taxes than it is to just move across city lines. So I think we really have to think about using tax vehicles that would primarily be administered at the state and federal levels that lend themselves to sort of progressive scaling and that are not regressive, like sales taxes can be, for instance, and that aren't premised on a pattern that we are actually actively trying to undermine, which is endless rise of housing prices. So I think that's the first point I would make, is simply that we should be thinking about shifting primary responsibility for school funding to a different level of government using different taxation tools. I do think that in the here and now, there are still ways in which we can make our systems of school finance that rely on property taxes more fair than they currently are, through a combination of a partial shift to a model that's more based on state and federal intervention, for one thing, and then also redistribution of that property tax sort of revenue on a regional basis within metropolitan areas. So if you as Tara mentioned, you have this legacy of racist housing policy and lending policy and land use policy and incorporation and annexation policies that has resulted in highly fractured, segregated metropolitan areas where there are what some scholars have called and community advocates have called racially concentrated areas of affluence, or places that are engaged in sort of opportunity hoarding. It's important that those places sort of don't, in the current moment, absent a sort of broader, more systemic shift, that they don't get a free ride, and that their sort of unfairly earned boost in property value that's premised on segregation and a racist housing system, gets reinvested back into the communities that have suffered because of their racist policies and practices. So I think, there's a big picture, long-term sort of eyes on the prize facet here, where if we're talking about decommodifying housing, we have to think about other tools and not property taxes. But I think there are things we can do in the interim to make systems based on property taxes fairer than they currently are.
Thanks, Thomas. Nelima, do you have anything to add in there?
Sure. I mean, I think I couldn't agree more with Thomas. I think for me, when I think about how the funding for the school is done, I think for me, the fundamental shift that needs to happen is we just have to change the way we think about about what our obligation is to educate all our kids. So for me, that is the premise that I start from. If we all agree that I think in many states school is compulsory, right? And so we need to make a commitment and say that we are going to educate every child, and at the level that they need, and at the level where the need is. And if we're talking about equity, then equity simply means that we are meeting the need, the need that exists. And so that means that, I mean, for example, in affluent communities, as Thomas has mentioned, people have more than enough, and so we're not having an equitable system when uh, children in affluent communities, um, you have more money being spent per child than for kids in low income areas, and this has huge implications. And this has huge implications on on the outcomes, the education outcomes that we have, and that is why we have this huge education gap that exists in our community. And as I mentioned before, all these things are not just happenstance. And so from an anti-racist and a racial justice perspective, if we are to move forward, then we have to correct the injustices that have led us to this place. I mean, if property taxes is a way of funding schools, then we have to talk about why are properties in neighborhoods where that are mostly inhabited by people of color, why do they have less values? And there's a historical context to that is very much rooted to redlining, racist policies, and practices. And so if we are to correct that, and so there's a correction that needs to be made, how do we make these communities whole again? How do we have a social justice lens in addressing this issue, so that we can say that, how do we begin to correct the idea that if you live in a community that is predominantly inhabited by Black people and people of color, then that means that you're going to that you're going to be going to a school that is underfunded. And as Thomas mentioned, even before we come to all these corrections about where the money comes from to fund the schools, in the here and now, there's some things that need to be addressed. For example, in the state of Minnesota, the way the funding is allocated, the allocations are made, and then the school district makes a determination about where the money goes and to what schools the money is going to be distributed. And if you look across the districts throughout our state, you will see also that the money is not necessarily following the child. And so we need to look into that. In my local school district, for example, when they started doing renovations, etc., the renovations always start in the affluent schools. And this and there's a lot to be said, and I think we also have to think about, there's also a lot to be said by the fact that um, school boards who make these decisions are elected, and so it's a political statement. And in my community, we have a school board that is concentrated, almost the whole school board comes from within a 1 mile radius of each other, in one corner of the school district that is the most affluent part of the school district. However, 65% of the students who are attending the school districts come from the other side of the district. And so the decision-making process, the decision who gets to decide where the money goes within the school district and how it's allocated is also something that if we are to achieve equity, we have to think about who is making those decisions, even when the money comes down, to a school district level. And so one of the examples that I know is talked a lot about is from the state of Wyoming, where even though the money, how they fund education comes from their property taxes, I think there's a certain threshold that that every school district reaches, and then there's a recapture of those funds, from the wealthier school district, and is redistributed to other poorer school districts. And so that is a method that I would like to see us continue to push for, even as we think about rethinking how we get the funding for schooling right now. But as we continue, if in the here and now, with using the property taxes, I think an equity model says that people should get what they need, and if we have a greater need in the poorer school districts, then we should go ahead and give and meet people where they are and fund everybody in an equitable way, so that we can begin to close the education gap that exists.
Thomas, I think you wanted to jump in. Go ahead.
Sure. So one point that Nelima mentioned related to how properties are appraised and how that factors into property tax revenue and school finance. And I just wanted to lift up a point about sort of racial inequality in appraisals. I think sometimes with appraisals, as with many other issues, there's a tendency to place the problem of discrimination and segregation and institutional racism in the past. But in our sort of proper conception of the problem, it really doesn't belong in the past. Yes, the FHA underwriting manuals from the 30s and 40s that explicitly baked racial segregation into home appraisal, may not be in place anymore. But there was an article that that some viewers might have seen that came out just last week in the New York Times, called Black Homeowners Face Discrimination in Appraisals, written by Deborah Kamen. And I think it provided a really stark example of what discrimination in appraisals can look like in 2020. There's a couple, a couple including one Black partner and one white partner. And they had their home appraised, and it was appraised for far less than they anticipated it to be appraised for. And then they ran an experiment, which was basically a sort of DIY or do-it-yourself exercise in what civil rights folks call fair housing testing, where they removed family pictures, they removed books by Black authors from the bookshelves, and the African-American partner wasn't present the next time that an appraiser came back. And it was appraised for about 40% more. So whether the appraisers in question were sort of motivated by explicit racially discriminatory intent, or whether this was a factor of implicit bias, it's just a really stark example of how even in 2020, the practices that were very institutionalized when our housing, in the really formative years of our national housing market, that those are still a problem today. They're not something that can be sort of resigned to the dustbin of history at this point, although we need to do the work to make sure that they are.
Thank
and then,
you.
Tara, if I can just make one more comment. I think to the point of why I think we need to expand how we fund how we fund schools, is because and the idea of a local of the local school is still is still a great idea, But I think, our society has transitioned. I mean, it's very rare that people, really stay at the same place, so that we have to be guided and say that I feel only responsible or obligated to educate the kids around my neighborhood on my property taxes being spent here, because more likely than not, the people who are coming to work in your community and are contributing to your community are traveling from afar, and so this idea that, we only have to, that our funds only have to be localized here, when in reality, you may be living here and you're traveling X number of miles, to go and work in a different community and making income there, then that means that we all need to share this obligation, and responsibility to ensure that every child, is being provided, a good education. In one of the affluent communities, in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities, we did a study, and we found out that, this affluent community actually depends on, nannies and cleaners and gardeners who are coming from much poorer communities, and also the people who are working in their fancy restaurants and hotels and in their retail, and in their retail spaces, who cannot afford to buy homes there. So your community is actually being run by folks who cannot afford to send their kids to a decent school. And so this idea of hyper localization, and we're only responsible for a certain radius, of kids around us, is something of the past. And that is why we really need to embrace this idea that we have an obligation to educate, all the children, all our kids in our communities and in the country as a whole.
Thanks so much, Nelima. And I'm loving learning from this really rich conversation. So we have a little bit of time left, and I think it would be odd, to say the least, if we didn't talk about some big news in housing from this week. On Tuesday, the Center for Disease Control put out an order that says that there is now a nationwide moratorium on evictions, and tenants and lawyers and advocates are still kind of trying to investigate what this order actually means and how it will be implemented. As of today, it's going to go into effect tomorrow, and it'll be in effect through the end of the year, through December 2020. So I wanted to start with you, Thomas. Can you just give us a high level on the CDC eviction moratorium, and also maybe let us know what questions are still remaining that lawyers and tenants and advocates will have to answer in the next couple of days?
Thanks, Tara. So the eviction order, is something that I hope and expect will prevent some real harm and real human suffering. So, I think there's room to greet aspects of it with some skepticism, but it is certainly something that will help to at least partially address the need that we're seeing and facing right now. It's also something, and I know Tara would agree, is the result of a mass mobilization of tenants who've been organizing to advance and protect their rights during this crisis. This is not sort of an act of sort of beneficence from the federal government. This is power conceding something to a demand. So just to say that to start. But the moratorium, so first thing to know is it applies to essentially all rental properties. There are exceptions around hotels, but it's a pretty broad range of properties that it applies to. And that is an improvement in terms of federal intervention around evictions from the CARES Act moratorium, which had expired in late July, and which only protected federally subsidized housing and housing with federally backed mortgages. So we've gone from a protection that maybe helped tenants in roughly 25, 30% of rental housing stock in the United States to effectively nearly 100% of rental housing stock. But from there are some sort of complex issues which tenants, social service providers, and legal services attorneys are going to have to navigate. So in order to be eligible, to be protected from eviction, rather, tenants have to provide a declaration to their landlords that attests to several sort of key points. One is that they have had a sort of a loss of income related to COVID. Another, and I'm not going to necessarily name off every single factor, but sort of highlight the key factors. One is that their income is anticipated to be below a certain level, and that can be established both by asserting that it's likely that their income will be below a certain level, by asserting that they did not have to file a federal income tax return in 2019, or that they received the $1,200 stimulus check under the CARES Act. They also have to state that they sort of took efforts or took steps to secure rental assistance from government agencies to the extent available. They also have to assert that they have made efforts to make partial payments to their landlords, even if they could not make full payments. And they have to sort of recognize or sort of acknowledge that they still have an obligation under their lease to pay rent during this period, and potentially to pay late fees and the like. So that's not necessarily the full picture, but those are some of the key points of what you have to declare to your landlord in order to have this protection. It's important to know that this declaration is something that's signed under oath. So in theory, if a law enforcement entity went after a tenant for allegedly having stated falsehoods in their declaration, they could be prosecuted for perjury, which is a criminal offense and a very serious issue. So you have to file this declaration first in order to get the protection from eviction later. So it's very important for tenants to be proactive, which is really a shortcoming of this intervention. There are huge sort of gaps in access to information about this process, rational fears that people might have about risking landlord retaliation by providing this declaration to their landlords, fear of being reported to, ICE and immigration authorities. So various reasons why it really isn't good public policy and doesn't make a lot of sense to put the initial onus on tenants to provide this declaration. But nonetheless, for tenants who sort of need that protection, it is incumbent upon them to take that first step and provide it to their landlords. The order from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that established the moratorium did provide a sort of fill-in-the-blank template declaration form, which is helpful as a starting point. And I know that multiple organizations are working on getting that form translated into multiple languages. I've already seen it translated into Spanish, and I anticipate that it will be translated into more languages. But it's, I'll say two more things. One is that if you compare this moratorium to the one that the House of Representatives passed as part of the HEROES Act, both in its duration and the practical mechanics of it, it falls far short of the HEROES Act eviction moratorium. So if we want to have a real eviction moratorium that seriously protects tenants while it is in place, more is needed. And on top of that, the HEROES Act would be on a firmer sort of legal footing than the CDC order, although I believe that the CDC order is lawful and constitutional. Industry groups have already, sort of publicly talked about plans to potentially challenge that order, and it could get held up in court in ways that the HEROES Act moratorium would not have been as susceptible to. The last piece is that there is an aspect of these moratoria which is both critically needed but also insufficient to the challenge at hand, which is that we're kicking the can down the road. We need to ideally cancel rent and mortgage payments in order to help people stay in their homes long term. We need to seriously revisit Representative Omar's Rent and Mortgage Payment Cancellation Act of 2020. And without that kind of substantial intervention to actually ensure that people aren't evicted when these moratoria end, we're simply going to have an eviction crisis at a different point in time. And we, as a society, it's the richest society in human history, cannot tolerate that outcome.
That's so spot on, Thomas. And the eviction crisis that we're kicking down the road would then occur in the middle of winter, right? If the moratorium expires at the end of December, then folks would just be facing eviction at these record numbers in the middle of January, which is really, really terrifying as someone who does this work on a local level. Nelima, I want to hand it to you. Could you add some more context on the order from the CDC this week, and also tell us how this is going to shake out in the Twin Cities?
Sure. Well, thank you. And I think Thomas's final comment just, hit the nail exactly where, what I wanted to say. But first, really want to acknowledge and really want to give kudos to the tenants, many of whom we've been organizing and etc., because we really came out the gate, the constituency base of tenants saying that, nobody should be kicked out of their home because this is a public health crisis. I mean, we and from the beginning, we just thought it was a no-brainer. Like, we're in the midst of a pandemic. We should not be evicting people, especially if we want to start containing the pandemic. So, and in Minnesota, we have been operating on this month by month eviction moratorium, which, and people have been making, decisions on a crisis mode. And so having an extended period of time for an eviction moratorium is what we really need to be looking at. On our end, we were really looking for an eviction moratorium that is going to extend right into mid 2021, when we feel is when we will either we will have a real handle of what this pandemic is and where it is, and figure out how we're vaccinating people. That is the point we felt that we could really begin to stabilize our communities. And ASA and our partners here in the Twin Cities, IX, Inquilinos Unidos por Justicia, we are of course been leading the Cancel the Rent, Cancel the Mortgage campaign. We really believe that canceling the rent and canceling the mortgage is what needs to happen, so that people are not living in their homes with this debt hanging over their head, because that is very real. Mental stress is a real issue in our communities right now around this COVID crisis. And I know there are a number of emergency rental assistance packages out here, which are good, but we know that the amount of money that has been put out is nowhere enough. So we know that there's not going to be enough money to go around, and that is why we need to cancel the rent and cancel the mortgage. And what we're also seeing in our communities is some people are choosing to do what we call self-eviction, right? Because even with the eviction moratoriums, and what I think we anticipate we're going to see as the deadline of the eviction moratorium gets closer, is and people have not been able to access the emergency rental assistance, is people are choosing to leave because who wants 5 months of rent, debt hanging over their head. So, and this goes back, to this idea about when we talk about how, the kind of solutions that we come up with and how they have to be crafted from, a racial justice, point of view, is, the idea of being shackled with debt is very burdensome, to our communities. And then when we think about why people are shouldering this burden, to begin with, it is because of a pandemic that they had no control over. And a lot of these folks don't have the luxury to be able to, work from home. And the one thing that I'll say, I think the wrong footing that, that we all started from is because we had a public crisis in our hands. And instead of dealing with it as a public crisis, I think the way a lot of the solutions have been crafted have been putting the burden, on the folks who are most impacted. Because even with this moratorium right now, as we see, the burden once again is on the tenants, to go and sign something under oath to say, and also to prove, and also to say that I have tried every means possible, even with the emergency rental assistance that is out there, the burden once again is on the tenants to go out and make the application on the emergency rental assistance. And in our community in the Twin Cities, the people who are most impacted, all these applications are online, and the same folks don't have access to the internet. The internet is not a public good, which is a discussion for another day, because it really should be, because in the midst of a pandemic when everything is online and the folks who are most impacted don't have access to internet to get the help that they need, we're still left in this in this perpetual cycle. So we would the eviction moratorium is great for now, but we would still like to continue pushing it ahead and saying that we would like to see the rent and the mortgage canceled so that people are not shackled with debt.
Thank you so much. And I couldn't agree more. Big props to Representative Omar. This is one of those examples where tenants came to her in the very earliest days of the pandemic and said, we don't actually want rental assistance because to us, that's a bailout to the landlord that puts the burden on the tenant to apply, right? What we want is the rent canceled and we want the mortgage canceled and we want you to provide some retroactive relief to property owners conditioned on a set of requirements, right? Because the other thing that rental assistance doesn't do is it doesn't confirm that the landlord won't just turn around and evict the tenant, right? And I think Nelima, your point about people just getting displaced because they're so fearful of the debt that's stacking up right now is such a real point, right? I'm talking to people every day in Kansas City, Missouri, where I live, where they just know what's coming, right? And even if they're protected from a formal eviction, they're so intimidated and overwhelmed by the prospect of overwhelming debt that they have to just get up and leave. They have to go double up on a couch. They have to go stay in a shelter. And that's, of course, the thing that we're trying to prevent the most. The CDC issued this order because it is a public health intervention. The federal government has said, stay home. And I think right now that's kind of the note that I want to end on is, I keep thinking that during this crisis, in the absence of a vaccine, housing has been the prescription, right? We were told to stay home. We were told to shelter in place. And for so many people, that was never an option. There were so many people unhoused before this crisis for whom that was never an option. And then for so many people, their housing itself is unhealthy to them, right? Or it's insecure in some way. So, with so much pain and so much hurt and loss during this time, this is also a moment of clarity, as everyone on this call has said. And it can be, to quote Arundhati Roy, it can be a portal. This moment can be a portal to a new world, a better world, to a world in which we have a homes guarantee. And I want to thank you both for your leadership. I also want to thank the Representative Ilhan Omar, who's one of our champions for a homes guarantee at the federal level. And of course, Representative Watson Coleman and Representative Deb Haaland for hosting this really incredible series talking about working families and how working families can be set up to thrive in the United States for once and for all. Also want to thank everyone who has tuned in to view this segment. My name is Tara Raghuveer. I work for People's Action with the Homes Guarantee Campaign. We've had our wonderful panelists, Thomas and Nelima. These are both experts in the field. I believe you can find them and their astounding work online, so please do look them up. And I've really enjoyed this conversation. I want to just remind folks that Representative Bonnie Watson-Coleman hosted a panel on the future of work on Tuesday, and Representative Deb Haaland hosted a discussion on the future of wealth just yesterday. And you can find both of those panels and the recordings at facebook.com/repbonnie, and of course on YouTube. And with that, thank you again, Thomas. Thanks, Nelima, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.